The congressional hearing room buzzed with tension as cameras rolled and C-SPAN viewers watched from homes across America. Representative Jasmine Crockett adjusted the microphone in front of her, her burgundy blazer sharp against the wood-paneled backdrop of the House Oversight Committee chamber. Across from her, Committee Chairman James Comer sat with the confidence of a man who thought he controlled the room. He had no idea that in the next 60 seconds his entire political career would come crashing down. Before we dive into this explosive moment that changed everything, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these crucial political showdowns that shape our nation. The morning had started like any other oversight hearing. Comer, the Kentucky Republican who'd spent months leading investigations and making bold claims about corruption, sat at the chairman's seat with his usual swagger. He'd been grilling witnesses all morning, throwing accusations and demanding answers, but when he turned his attention to Jasmine Crockett, the freshman Democrat from Texas, he made the biggest mistake of his political life. Representative Crockett. Comer began, his voice dripping with condescension. Perhaps you should focus more on understanding basic committee procedures before trying to lecture us on oversight. The room fell silent. Several Democrats shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Republicans smirked, thinking their chairman had just put another freshman in their place. But Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Comer's, and what happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media, news channels, and political discussions for years to come. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you need to know who these two people really are. James Comer had been riding high as the chairman of the House Oversight Committee. The 51-year-old Kentucky Republican had built his entire reputation on being a tough investigator, someone who could dig up dirt and expose corruption. He'd spent the last 2 years making headlines with investigation after investigation, appearing on Fox News regularly and positioning himself as a rising star in the Republican Party. Comer came from Kentucky farming stock, always presenting himself as a down-to-earth country boy who'd made good. He'd been in politics since 2000, slowly climbing the ladder from state representative to U.S. congressman. By 2023, he'd finally gotten the position he'd always wanted, chairman of the powerful House Oversight Committee. This was supposed to be his moment, his time to shine on the national stage, but James Comer had developed a reputation for something else too, his dismissive attitude toward younger members, especially women and particularly women of color. He'd interrupt them during hearings, talk over them, and make snide comments about their experience. Most members just took it, not wanting to rock the boat or appear confrontational. That's where he miscalculated with Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine Crockett was not your typical freshman representative. At 42, she'd already built an impressive legal career as a civil rights attorney in Texas. She'd defended people whom the system had forgotten, fought against injustice in courtrooms across the state, and earned a reputation as someone you didn't want to face in court. She was brilliant, with degrees from Rhodes College and the University of Houston Law Center. More importantly, she came to Congress with something many freshmen lacked. She wasn't afraid of anybody. Growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, Crockett had learned early how to stand up for herself. Her parents taught her that respect was earned, not given, based on titles or positions. She'd carried that lesson through law school, through her legal practice, and now into the halls of Congress. She'd been a public defender, representing people whom society had written off. She knew how to fight for the underdog because she'd been doing it her entire career. The Texas representative had only been in Congress for a year, but she'd already made waves. She didn't play the usual political games. She didn't defer to seniority just because that's how things had always been done. And she definitely didn't let anyone, regardless of their position, disrespect her or her constituents. The stakes of this confrontation went far beyond just these two individuals. This was about the changing face of Congress, about who gets to speak and who gets silenced, about whether the old guard could continue their traditional power plays in a new era. Comer represented the establishment, the traditional power structure that had run Washington for decades. Crockett represented change, a new generation that wasn't asking for permission to be heard. What made this moment even more significant was the backdrop of the hearing itself. The committee had been investigating alleged corruption in government contracts, and Comer had been grandstanding all morning, making accusations without solid evidence, playing to the cameras rather than seeking truth. He'd been using his position to score political points, and everyone knew it. But nobody had called him out directly. That was about to change. The tension had been building throughout the morning session. Comer had spent the first 2 hours of the hearing interrupting Democratic members, cutting off their time and making sarcastic comments whenever they tried to speak. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had tried to ask a question about documentation, and Comer had cut her off mid-sentence, saying her time had expired even though she had 2 minutes left on the clock. When Representative Maxwell Frost attempted to enter evidence into the record, Comer dismissed it as irrelevant without even looking at it. But it was his treatment of the witnesses that really showed his true colors. He'd brought in several government contractors to testify about supposed irregularities, but whenever their testimony didn't support his predetermined narrative, he'd become hostile. One witness, a career civil servant with 30 years of experience, had tried to explain that the contracts in question had followed all proper procedures. Comer's response was to question the man's competence and suggest he might be covering something up. "Mr. Chairman," Crockett had interjected at one point, "the witness is trying to answer your question if you'd let him finish." Comer had turned to her with a patronizing smile. "Representative Crockett, you'll have your turn to ask questions. Please don't interrupt." "I'm not interrupting," Crockett replied calmly. "I'm pointing out that you're not allowing the witness to complete his answers." "I've been running hearings since before you were practicing law," Comer shot back. "I think I know how to conduct an investigation." Several Republicans chuckled. One cried out, "Ah!" They all chuckled. Comer's chief of staff, sitting behind him, smirked and whispered something to another staffer. They thought they were watching their chairman put an uppity freshman in her place. They had no idea they were watching the beginning of the end. As the hearing continued, Comer's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was clearly frustrated that the witnesses weren't giving him the sound bites he wanted for his Fox News appearance that evening. He started raising his voice, banging his gavel unnecessarily, and making theatrical gestures for the cameras. It was political theater at its worst, and everyone could see it except apparently James Comer himself. Then came the moment that triggered everything. Crockett had been allotted 5 minutes to question the witnesses. She'd prepared carefully, having actually read all the documentation, unlike some of her colleagues. She began asking precise, pointed questions that were getting to the heart of the matter. The witnesses were finally able to explain what had really happened with the contracts in question, and it was becoming clear that there was no scandal, no corruption, just standard government procedures that Comer had tried to twist into something sinister. Comer couldn't let that narrative stand. 3 minutes into Crockett's time, he interrupted. "Representative Crockett, your questions are leading the witness," he declared, even though they absolutely were not. Crockett paused, looked directly at him, and said, "Mr. Chairman, I am asking open-ended questions that allow the witness to explain the facts. If you're concerned about leading questions, perhaps we should review the transcript of your earlier interrogation." The Democratic side of the committee perked up. Had she just challenged the chairman directly? Comer's face reddened. "Representative Crockett, you're out of order." "I'm not out of order, Mr. Chairman. I'm using my allotted time to question the witness, which is my right as a member of this committee." "Your time is expired," Comer declared, even though the clock clearly showed she had 2 minutes remaining. That's when Crockett made a decision. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. She'd watched Comer bulldoze her colleagues all morning, abuse his power as chairman, and turn what should have been a serious oversight hearing into his personal political show. Someone needed to stop him, and apparently that someone was going to be her. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice steady but with an edge that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "My time is not expired and we both know it. But since you seem determined to silence me, let me use the time I have left to address something that actually matters." Comer banged his gavel. "You're out of order." "No, Mr. Chairman," Crockett replied, her voice rising just enough to be heard over his gavel. "You're out of order. You've been out of order all morning, and frankly, you've been out of order since you became chairman of this committee." The room gasped. Several reporters in the press section leaned forward. The C-SPAN cameras, which usually pan slowly between speakers, locked onto the developing confrontation. Something unprecedented was happening. What happened next would be replayed, analyzed, and discussed for years to come. Jasmine Crockett stood up from her seat, not in aggression, but with the controlled power of someone who had argued cases in hostile courtrooms. She had exactly 60 seconds to make her point, and she was going to make every word count. "Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice clear and devastating in its precision. "You want to talk about understanding procedures? Let's talk about procedures. In the past 6 months, you violated House Rules 17 times during committee hearings. I have the citations right here." She held up a folder and Comer's face went from red to pale. "You've cut off Democratic members 47 times before their time expired. You've allowed Republican members to exceed their time limits 23 times without objection. You've refused to enter Democratic evidence into the record 15 times while accepting Republican submissions without review." Comer tried to bang his gavel again, but Crockett continued, her voice cutting through the noise. "But that's just procedure, Mr. Chairman. Let's talk about substance. You've held 12 hearings on supposed corruption without producing a single piece of concrete evidence. You've brought in witnesses who later admitted they had no first-hand knowledge of wrongdoing. You've leaked selective excerpts of testimony to friendly media outlets while classifying full transcripts that show your narrative is false." The Republican side of the committee was frozen. Several members were looking at Comer, waiting for him to respond, to shut this down, but he seemed paralyzed. "You've wasted millions of taxpayer dollars on investigations that you knew would go nowhere because they were never about finding truth. They were about getting yourself on television, about building your political profile, about auditioning for higher office on the taxpayer's dime." Then Crockett delivered the kill shot. "But here's what really matters, Mr. Chairman. While you've been playing politics, I've been doing the actual work, and in doing that work, I discovered something interesting about your own financial disclosures." The room went completely silent. Even the staffers stopped typing. "Would you like to explain to this committee why you failed to disclose 3 land deals in Kentucky that netted you over $2 million 0 cents? Would you like to explain why those deals involved companies that later received federal contracts you personally advocated for? Would you like to explain why you've been using your position on this committee to conduct oversight of your business competitors while protecting your business partners?" Comer's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. His chief of staff was frantically whispering in his ear, but Comer wasn't listening. He was watching his career implode in real time. "I have the documents, Mr. Chairman," Crockett continued, now holding up a thick manila envelope. "Financial records, emails, text messages, all obtained legally through FOIA requests and public records searches. The kind of actual investigation you claim to conduct, but never quite managed to complete." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "So here's what's going to happen, Mr. Chairman. You're going to stop interrupting members of this committee, you're going to run these hearings according to House rules, and you're going to stop using this committee as your personal campaign platform. Because if you don't, I'll be submitting all of this evidence to the Ethics Committee this afternoon." The Democratic side of the committee erupted in whispers. Several Republicans looked shocked. The press section was in chaos as reporters frantically typed on their phones, trying to be the first to break this bombshell story. Comer finally found his voice, but it came out weak and strangled. This is outrageous. You can't threaten the chairman." "I'm not threatening you, Mr. Chairman," Crockett replied, sitting back down with perfect composure. "I'm informing you of the consequences of your actions, something you should be familiar with given your position on the Oversight Committee." And then she delivered the final blow. "Oh, and Mr. Chairman, the next time you want to question someone's understanding of committee procedures, you might want to make sure you're not violating federal disclosure laws while you do it. My time is expired. I yield back." The silence that followed was deafening. Comer sat there, gavel in hand, unable to speak. His fellow Republicans were looking at him with a mixture of shock and anger. They'd been blindsided. Their chairman, their leader in the oversight battles, had just been exposed as potentially corrupt himself. Representative Jim Jordan, sitting next to Comer, leaned over and whispered urgently in his ear. Comer nodded numbly and then did something that shocked everyone. He called for an immediate recess. Without another word, he stood up and walked out of the room, his staff scrambling to follow him. The moment Comer left, the room exploded. Reporters rushed toward Crockett, shouting questions. Democratic members surrounded her, some congratulating her, others asking to see the documents. Republican members huddled in corners, trying to figure out what had just happened and what it meant for their investigations going forward. But Crockett remained calm in the center of the storm. She'd done what she came to do. She'd stood up to a bully who'd been abusing his power, and she'd done it with facts, evidence, and the kind of preparation that comes from years of fighting in courtrooms where the stakes were even higher than political careers. Within minutes, The video of Crockett's 60-second destruction of James Comer was everywhere. Crockett destroys Comer started trending on Twitter before the hearing even resumed. The clip was shared thousands of times in the first hour. News outlets that had been planning to lead with other stories scrambled to get their political correspondents on air to discuss what had just happened. CNN's Jake Tapper interrupted regular programming with breaking news. Explosive confrontation in House Oversight Committee as Representative Jasmine Crockett accuses Chairman James Comer of financial improprieties. Fox News, which had been Comer's favorite platform, suddenly found themselves in an awkward position. They tried to spin it at first, with one commentator suggesting Crockett was grandstanding, but even their viewers could see what had really happened. The video didn't lie. Comer had been exposed, and he'd had no response. On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow dedicated her entire opening segment to breaking down Crockett's accusations point by point. What we witnessed today wasn't just a political confrontation, she said. It was a complete dismantling of a committee chairman who thought he was untouchable. The political world was in chaos. Republican leadership called an emergency meeting. They needed to figure out how to handle this crisis. If Crockett's allegations were true, and she seemed to have the receipts to prove they were, then Comer couldn't remain as chairman. But removing him would be admitting defeat, admitting that their star investigator was, himself, corrupt. Meanwhile, Democrats were energized in a way they hadn't been in months. Crockett had shown them that they didn't have to sit back and take abuse from Republican committee chairs. They could fight back, and if they did their homework, they could win. Within 3 hours of the confrontation, Comer's office released a statement. It was weak, defensive, and notably didn't deny any of Crockett's specific allegations. Chairman Comer has always conducted himself according to the highest ethical standards, the statement read. These baseless attacks are an attempt to distract from the important oversight work of the committee. But the statement only made things worse. If the attacks were baseless, why hadn't Comer denied them in the moment? Why had he fled the hearing room? Why was he now hiding behind a press release instead of defending himself publicly? By evening, the story had evolved. Investigative reporters from major newspapers had started digging into Crockett's allegations. The Washington Post found the land records she'd referenced. The New York Times discovered the connections between Comer's business dealings and federal contracts. Politico uncovered emails that seemed to support Crockett's claims about Comer protecting his business partners from oversight. Republican members of the Oversight Committee started distancing themselves from their chairman. Representative Nancy Mace told reporters, "If these allegations are true, it's deeply concerning. We need to get to the bottom of this." Even Jim Jordan, Comer's closest ally on the committee, seemed to be hedging his bets. "We need to see all the evidence before making any judgments," he said, which in Washington speak meant he was preparing to throw Comer under the bus if necessary. The next morning, Jasmine Crockett appeared on Morning Joe. She was calm, professional, and devastating in her precision. When asked about the confrontation, she didn't gloat or celebrate. Instead, she focused on the issues. "This isn't about me versus Chairman Comer," she said. "This is about the integrity of the Oversight Committee. We're supposed to be investigating corruption, not engaging in it. The American people deserve better than what they've been getting." When pressed about her evidence, she was careful, but confident. "I've provided all relevant documentation to the appropriate authorities. The Ethics Committee will investigate, and I'm confident they'll find what I found, a pattern of behavior that violates the public trust." The interview went viral, adding fuel to an already raging fire. Crockett wasn't just smart and prepared, she was also media savvy. She knew how to make her case to the public, not just to other politicians. By the end of the week, the pressure had become unbearable. 3 major newspapers had published editorials calling for Comer to step down as chairman. Several Republican donors had privately expressed concerns to party leadership. Even conservative commentators, who usually defended Republicans no matter what, were having trouble spinning this one. Then came the leaked audio. Someone, presumably from inside the Republican caucus, leaked a recording of a private meeting where Comer was heard saying, "I don't care what that woman thinks she has on me. I'm not stepping down." The dismissive way he said that woman only reinforced the narrative that he was a misogynist who'd finally been taken down by a woman who was simply better at his job than he was. The Ethics Committee announced they were opening a formal investigation. This was serious. Ethics investigations could lead to censure, expulsion, or criminal referrals. Comer's political career wasn't just damaged, It was potentially over. 2 weeks after the confrontation, James Comer held a press conference. He looked tired, defeated, and angry. He announced that he was temporarily stepping aside as chairman of the Oversight Committee to focus on clearing my name from these false accusations. But everyone knew the truth. He was finished. Comer believed the truth. He was finished. You don't temporarily step aside from a chairmanship and come back. Once you've lost that power, it's gone forever. The Republican Party moved quickly to contain the damage. They appointed a new acting chairman and tried to refocus on their investigations. But the damage was done. The Oversight Committee had lost all credibility. How could they investigate anyone else for corruption when their own chairman had been exposed as potentially corrupt? For Jasmine Crockett, the confrontation transformed her from a freshman representative into a national figure. She started receiving speaking invitations from all over the country. Political organizations wanted her to train their candidates on how to stand up to bullies. Law schools invited her to speak about the intersection of legal training and political action. But Crockett remained focused on her job. She didn't do a victory lap or write a book about the confrontation. She went back to work, representing her constituents and fighting for the issues that mattered to them. When asked about Comer in subsequent interviews, she would simply say, "That's being handled by the appropriate authority. I'm focused on the work the American people sent me here to do." The impact of the confrontation went far beyond just Comer and Crockett. It changed the dynamic in Congress. Committee chairs, especially Republican ones, became more careful about how they conducted hearings. They couldn't just bulldoze minority members anymore, not when those members might have done their homework and be ready to fight back. Young Democratic members, especially women and people of color, were inspired by Crockett's example. They started preparing more thoroughly for hearings, doing opposition research on committee chairs, and standing up for themselves when they were disrespected. The old boys club that had run Congress for so long was being challenged, and they were losing. Political scientists would later write about the Crockett effect, the phenomenon of junior members of Congress successfully challenging senior leadership through preparation, evidence, and strategic confrontation. It became a case study in political science classes about how power dynamics in Congress were changing. The Ethics Committee investigation into Comer continued for months. Leaks from the investigation suggested that Crockett's allegations were just the tip of the iceberg. There were more land deals, more conflicts of interest, more violations of disclosure laws. Comer hired expensive lawyers and tried to fight back, but the evidence was overwhelming. 6 months after the confrontation, James Comer announced he would not seek re-election. He claimed he wanted to spend more time with his family and focus on his business interests. But everyone knew the truth. His political career was over. He'd been destroyed in 60 seconds by a freshman representative who'd simply done her homework and had the courage to speak truth to power. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Comer had built his career on investigating others, on exposing what he claimed was corruption and malfeasance. But when someone finally investigated him, when someone finally held him to the same standards he claimed to uphold, he crumbled instantly. He couldn't take even a fraction of what he'd been dishing out for years. The transformation of Jasmine Crockett from freshman representative to national political figure was complete when she was invited to deliver the keynote address at the National Bar Association's annual convention. Standing before thousands of lawyers, many of whom were young women of color who saw her as a role model, she delivered a speech that would be quoted for years. "Power without accountability is tyranny," she said. "Whether that power is in a courtroom, a boardroom, or a committee room, it must be challenged when it's abused. We have a responsibility, not just as lawyers or politicians, but as citizens, to stand up to bullies, to speak truth to power, and to do it with facts, evidence, and unwavering determination." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. A year after the confrontation, a documentary about the incident premiered at Sundance. It featured interviews with political insiders, journalists who covered the story, and members of Congress from both parties. The most revealing interview was with a former Comer staffer who admitted, "We knew he was playing fast and loose with the rules. We warned him that someone would eventually call him out. We just never imagined it would be a freshman member who'd only been in Congress for a year." The documentary also revealed something that hadn't been widely known. Crockett had been preparing for that confrontation for months. She'd noticed Comer's behavior in previous hearings and had started documenting every violation, every abuse of power. She'd hired researchers with her own money to investigate his business dealings. She'd consulted with former parliamentarians about House rules and procedures. When the moment came, she was ready. "I knew I'd only get one shot," Crockett said in the documentary. "If I was going to take on the chairman, I had to be perfect. I had to have evidence he couldn't refute, accusations he couldn't deflect. I had to be prepared for every possible response he might have." In the end, he had no response, because he never imagined anyone would have the audacity to challenge him directly. The documentary won several awards and further cemented the confrontation as a pivotal moment in American political history. It wasn't just about two people in a committee room. It was about the changing nature of power in America, about who gets to speak and who gets silenced, about what happens when the old guard meets a new generation that refuses to play by the old rules. Political campaigns started studying the confrontation as a masterclass in political combat. The key lessons were clear. Preparation beats position, facts beat bluster, and courage beats intimidation. Candidates started asking themselves, what would Jasmine Crockett do when faced with bullying opponents or unfair treatment? The impact on the Republican Party was significant. They had to reckon with the fact that their oversight strategy had backfired spectacularly. They'd empowered chairs like Comer to be aggressive, to push boundaries, to prioritize political theater over actual governance. But that strategy only worked if no one pushed back. Crockett had pushed back, and their whole house of cards had collapsed. Some Republicans privately admitted that Crockett had done them a favor. Comer had become a liability. His investigations were going nowhere, and he was making the party look foolish. By taking him down, Crockett had solved a problem they didn't know how to solve themselves. Of course, they could never say that publicly, but in the back rooms of Washington, some Republicans were grateful. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, had found a new star. Crockett was everything they wanted in a new generation of leaders: smart, tough, principled, and unafraid. She could go toe-to-toe with anyone, and she had the legal background and political instincts to win. There was already talk of her running for Senate, maybe even higher office someday. But Crockett remained focused on the present. In interviews, she consistently redirected attention from herself to the issues she cared about: civil rights, economic justice, and government accountability. She understood that the confrontation with Comer had given her a platform, and she was determined to use it for more than just personal advancement. The confrontation also had a profound impact on how congressional hearings were covered by the media. Before Crockett-Comer, as it came to be known, hearings were often boring affairs that only political junkies watched on C-SPAN. But the viral nature of the confrontation showed that hearings could be must-see TV if members were willing to engage in substantive fact-based challenges to power. News networks started covering hearings more extensively, looking for the next viral moment. This had both positive and negative effects. On the positive side, it brought more public attention to the work of Congress. On the negative side, some members started performing for the cameras, trying to create their own viral moments without the substance that had made Crockett's confrontation so powerful. The key difference, which many imitators missed, was that Crockett hadn't been performing. She'd been doing her job, conducting oversight, demanding accountability, and representing her constituents. The confrontation went viral not because she was trying to create a moment, but because she was genuinely standing up to abuse of power with facts and evidence. 2 years after the confrontation, James Comer was indicted on federal charges related to his undisclosed business dealings. The investigation that started with Crockett's revelations had uncovered a pattern of corruption that went back years. Comer had been using his political position to enrich himself and his associates while pretending to be a champion of government accountability. The trial was a media sensation. Crockett was called as a witness, and her testimony was devastating. She methodically laid out the evidence she'd uncovered, explaining how she'd connected the dots between Comer's public actions and his private dealings. The prosecution later said her testimony was crucial to securing a conviction. When Comer was found guilty on multiple counts, it was seen as a complete vindication of Crockett's actions. She'd been right about everything. The man who'd tried to silence her, who dismissed her as an inexperienced freshman who didn't understand how things worked, was going to federal prison. The irony was lost on no one. This incredible story shows us that standing up to power isn't just possible, it's necessary for democracy to function. If you found this story as inspiring as millions of others have, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Ring the notification bell so you never miss these critical landscapes that shape our political landscape. Share this video with anyone who needs to see that bullies can be defeated when we have the courage to stand up to them with facts, preparation, and determination. Comment below, what would you have done in Crockett's position? And remember, in democracy, every voice matters, especially yours.